Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit, co-hosted by Igor Schwartzman and me, Johannes Kleske. Follow the Rabbit is the podcast where we explore cultural phenomena and decode emerging trends to help you update your mental models of the world. So we took a bit of time out due to a lot of projects on our plates, but now we're back with the monthly review for July. And we have two pieces for you. So you might be wondering, what connects a sea of white men in bucket hats to Sam Altman's relentless narrative building around AGI? It's more than you might think. This month, we're connecting between two very different cultural phenomena that both reveal something fascinating about how authenticity gets manufactured and why that matters for everyone trying to understand how culture actually moves. Igor has brought a piece about the background to the Oasis concert happening recently in Manchester, connection to fashion and culture, and apparently it has a lot to do with bucket hats. And I, this month, finished listening to the book version of Karen Howe's Empire of AI, which tells the full story of OpenAI so far. And is really a fascinating read and strong recommendation by me to anyone who wants to catch up on anything generative AI. Let's dive right in to our conversation about these two pieces.
Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. We have quite two different stories for you today. As usual, we're not trying to fit into any of the classic shelves. We're just trying to stretch them as much as we can. I'm talking about Oasis today. And I have to admit, there are some, things that are just so painful to miss and like concerts. And this one was definitely one of them. Like I basically, I think millions of other people learned about the fact that tickets are available when they were already all sold out. And the secondary market was not, gentle or pretty. So I unfortunately haven't been there, despite the fact that quite a few of my friends managed to snatch up tickets and forgot me. You know who you are. But the reason that why I'm talking about this is not just a concert, but something that was just kind of interesting as an observation about what this concert, what this reunion actually kind of triggered, how much, of an aesthetic component there is to this band and to the context in which they exist. And to start this off, I think it's one of those interesting side bits. And if you have been following even remotely this story at all, you've probably seen it on Instagram or other places as well, that this has such a major impact on, culture in the UK, but outside of it as well, that a brand like Aldi, the German supermarket, actually rebranded itself for this concert in Manchester to so the logo said Aldeh, which is kind of like, I'm not going to try my Manchester accent. So, but basically they acknowledged how Oasis kind of like pronounced their name and rebranded themselves for this context. But it's not just about that part, although I have to say even Lidl kind of like tried to get into the same kind of tailwind of this momentous occasion happening in Manchester over a course of, I think, a week, about the multiple concerts that they gave one after another. It was actually quite a lot of things going on, and a lot of it is actually about clothing. Now, I don't know how much of a fan you are or were about Oasis, but one of the things that if you are, you probably notice about them is them wearing a lot of anoraks. And, there are really funny videos of Liam Gallagher, for example, on YouTube standing backstage at a concert in the olden days and wearing a Stone Island anorak and complaining about the fact that the music industry has to save money and that there used to be like a guy who was making his tea and a guy who's collecting his sandwiches, but now he has to do it all by himself wearing a very expensive anorak. And I think this is like what is kind of fascinating to me, and it was triggered by this article at Domus, was this exploration of what that actually means, and especially like in a geographic context, how this band provides through the way how they behave, but also through the way what they wear, an ability for people to have a connection. And a lot of it is about masculinity as well, because obviously those are men, and it was just really funny for me. So a friend of ours, a friend of the podcast, Ken, was there with his son, and he was like, it was just amazing to see the sea of white men wearing bucket hats. So the bucket hat obviously is a very kind of classic example of his wardrobe when Britpop and those bands were really big. But it obviously allowed a lot of people to like it. It's such a long time ago that people started wearing bucket hats again without having been born during the time when they were actually emerged. And so there is like this connection that kind of, the connection between people who just got into this and people who were in this for a very long time, all unified by those concerts. And I want to kind of read from this article at Domus because I thought it was really an interesting component about understanding why this concert or this reunion of this band was such a momentous thing. So Oasis emerged at a time when working class northern masculinity was still being sidelined within mainstream representation. Oasis brought that identity back into view using both performance and dress to do so. What they wore helped assert visibility, articulate class identity, and push back against marginalization. The clothing they relied on, parkas, trainers, branded sportswear, was a deliberate uniform grounded in geography and resistance. I thought that was just a really beautiful way of connecting some of the things that we're looking at through, different episodes, like why are third places reemerging? Why are certain, behaviors reemerging? It's because people are really craving this idea of connection and identity that is not fragmented or fractal. And the interesting part seems to be that it is much easier to do so through heritage brands. I mean, they are quite old now because it is somehow tied to a time or a perception of a time when bigger things had more pull. Now, I think, I think like it's clear that, in the 90s, when before the internet kind of emerged, bigger brands had more leverage. And it's kind of interesting that if you as a brand, because Oasis, for better or worse, are a brand, if you kind of sustain that identity, which I mean, they did by being super dysfunctional. Like, I think like them being on and off and just kind of fighting and just really kind of like, I think that strangeness about them kind of sustained the idea of what Oasis is. And I think those are really kind of fascinating ties manifesting through this kind of concert. And there is a sea of, different Instagram accounts exploring what they're wearing, why. I think it's also very connected to why, for example, a brand like Stone Island, I mean, if you ever watch a Premier League game or like a streaming and there is like, you will eventually always see not one, but a couple of people in the audience wearing Stone Island. Why? Because, wearing that brand kind of gets you to be connected to a specific group of people. So it's about identity and geography as well. So I think, there's in this cluster of things, I think that article kind of triggered a lot and, those concerts triggered a lot of memories. And it's just kind of an interesting way of looking how people are craving that connection today.
Yeah, I think so we always talk about cultural phenomena, and I think we can safely put Oasis in the bucket of cultural phenomena and these re-emergences of these big music stars. I mean, it's fascinating. Like it's that at the same time, like right now, like Linkin Park are back touring the stadiums around the world and filling those up. So it's not just It's not just Coldplay and Taylor Swift anymore, catering to very certain audiences. I know why you're chuckling when I mentioned Coldplay and stadiums.
Cheat apparently people too.
Yeah, it's a dangerous place out there at the Coldplay concert.
I mean, on that note, there was a post, I think, by Liam saying we don't have that kind of shit that Coldplay has. So if you're cheating, you're free. You're free to do so at our concerts.
Have you ever at our concerts? Just wear a bucket hat, and we're all good. It's also bucket hat makes it easier to disguise yourself.
Yeah.
And then again, it's interesting how brands are like really like going into that. And like Aldi and Lidl, like you mentioned. So it's all like activation now. And I think there is this, again, like tying it back to like this post lifestyle branding, where you don't know anymore how much of it is brand activation, how much is just a funny idea, how much are the fans embracing it, how much they're just like, okay, whatever, I know they make money out of me, I don't care. It's all seems to move beyond that, and you just go with it. Like I've seen like Linkin Park, like they just put up pop-up shops now with like limited edition tees and all kinds of stuff in every city. Then they later play. They have like special editions for each city of t-shirts and like special things. And we're like, it's unbelievably how much money they must make on this stuff. But the fans are gladly buying it. And I'm like, hey, if they want it, it makes sense. So yeah, I'm just fascinated to observe this, because we talk so much about like niche as the new mainstream and stuff like that, but there still there's a hunger, there's an urge for these big mainstream cultural identifiers that people want to connect to, because it also, like in a very polarized society, it feels like there are still these cultural signifier that we can come together around. And it's clear that Oasis could have sold 10 or 100 times the tickets they sold already, because everybody wanted to be part of that.
Well, yeah, but at the same time, I mean, the kind of production company tied them to a contract that made sure that they will only receive their money when all the concerts are actually finished, to make sure that they will not kind of, get into one of their usual Noel and Liam kind of things. So smart. I think there's probably a limit to how many concerts that could have survived. But on that Lidl part, I think like Lidl actually released an anorak, and it's like it includes a bottle opener and a refrigerating pocket, and they actually did their homework in terms of how it is designed. It's mimicking a certain kind of flavor, but they didn't they didn't just do an anorak that they wanted to make money off. They actually committed themselves to donating all that money that they're making from this anorak to charity. What they wanted is an ability to, on the one hand, obviously profit from something that's happening in culture. But at the same time, they're also kind of very aware of where this lands if you would just kind of do this for yourself. I think that was kind of a clever move to address also, the fact that less and less people can afford a Stone Island jacket. So they're addressing, on the one hand, the need for belonging and authenticity, but at the same time also being aware that not everyone, especially not working class people in the northern part of England, can afford all the fancy stuff all the time. Not that they ever could, I think, but as those brands are becoming more and more expensive, it becomes, there's a stretch of how much you can do as a participant in that culture. So people are left, so I asked Ken, obviously, how many Stone Island jackets that they have seen during the concert. And unfortunately, the number was pretty low because it was so hot. So even the diehard fan who usually would kind of dress up for the occasion. It was more tank tops and bucket hats.
But don't they have super breathable material?
Yes. Well, there's a limit to breathability.
There's a limit to everything. I mean, it's like what I had to think of is that music has always had these combination of, it is mostly about the experience, like going to a concert is about the experience, but then music always understand to give you also the item or the product to buy to remind you of the experience. Like you would always, I mean, forever you could buy tour shirts and stuff like that. And when you talked about it, I had to think of like how this has now like spread to all kinds of things. Like, I mean, there's a research collective in Berlin who just released a research report where you could also buy a limited edition T-shirt that comes with the research report. It's like, okay, we might have taken this too far. It seems like nowadays, if there isn't a limited T-shirt, has it happened at all? Had it have any significance?
It's a little bit transmediale audience, I guess. But I think, I mean, that part is definitely, identity signaling versus actual identity is really interesting. I think that kind of brings us back to this idea: why does something like Oasis resonate so deeply, while everyone, even a research collective, releasing and T-shirts alongside the report, is actually kind of an acknowledgement that nobody cares about what you do today because everything is just so small. So there is, like, it's very skeuomorphic in a strange way, where trying to pretend that there is a functionality to the thing that you're doing today that is mimicking something that came from the 90s. In certain cases, and we talked, in previous episodes about this, like this idea that, every restaurant starts now basically with, or a coffee place, like not every, but, a certain kind of brand of them, you kind of, they open and there's instantly merch. And that
even
is,
before,
yeah,
like
you're like,
you finance through merch.
Yeah. How can I be a fan if I didn't even, actually, did this? And I think like a lot of it is,
it's not that you've been a fan before it was cool. Now you've been a fan before it even was a thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's that's definitely tied to economics. I think it's tied to this idea that, Indiegogo and Kickstarter popularized by you kind of buying a piece of it. Weirdly, though, you never actually become a shareholder, so you're really not buying anything. So I think, there is a disconnect there, which those smaller things, coffee places, restaurants, research collectives, what they cannot do is give you actual belonging. They just give you a T-shirt, and something like Oasis can. And so fostering actual community, actual belonging, like, authenticity, like taste, requires time. Like you cannot have it, you can't just have it now without having done so. You need to establish something. And some people call it brand, some call it authenticity, some brands call it both. But I think a component of time is required in this idea of establishing something that will create genuine belonging.
But I think it's an interesting question because it reminded me of our discussion around indie magazines and their return, and especially as something that you can touch, like a physical object that is by definition like a counterpart to digital content that you just doom scroll and don't put any significance on that. And I wonder, like at some point, like it feels like you can buy the T-shirt, it doesn't really give you belonging, but at some point that turns around because you've bought the T-shirts and you've bought the much more expensive hand-printed edition of the report. You start to feel a certain type of belonging. So it could be like this is how you establish it now, which I find it interesting. At what starts, so there's the Oasis part where you connect to an older cultural like identifier, but how do you establish a new one? And is like doing physical objects like a shortcut there that is just not feasible in a purely digital context? So you don't connect to digital brands at all, but if I have the t-shirt here, it instantly creates a different connection.
I think, this is a much bigger discussion, but I think a substantial part of authenticity is effort. And I think, coming to the idea of indie magazine versus the t-shirt, let's put it this way.
Yeah.
I think an indie magazine, just purely by the fact how much effort needs to go in creating every single kind of edition or issue, is in itself already more authentic than the t-shirt, because everyone can make a t-shirt. I'm letting someone print socks right now with just a stupid saying, and it took me like 4 emails and 100 euros, and I will get 30 pairs of socks. They don't mean shit. They're just really funny, and it's just kind of a very kind of clear expression of what you can do today if you just have an idea. Does that mean it's authentic? Not at all. Is it like a small thing that is associated with me as a person and kind of like the joke that I will do? Yeah. And people in my kind of peer group will kind of appreciate that, but it will not create any form of meaningful connection to people who don't know me personally and will not be aware of the joke. But I think, just generally, I think, the effort of going somewhere to attend, to be with other people, that effort, like if you kind of have enough reason in yourself to go somewhere, that in itself makes it psychologically and just kind of like on the process in your brain, like you commit yourself to something in a time where no commitment from you is actually required whatsoever. You can have everything you ever need without leaving your couch ever. And I think, those purposeful notions of effort, I think I have this kind of saying where seamless is sameness. Like it's very hard to just like, if your core proposition is that it's just easy, then you cannot ever have that other thing. Like it's just not there.
But that's the funny part about the research report with the limited edition t-shirt. You can only get the t-shirt if you come to their office in Berlin and pick it up.
Oh, there you go.
So to make your point, should we go from one cultural phenomena to another one?
Please.
So Oasis is one cultural phenomena. OpenAI.
I think it's actually a much more triggering cultural phenomena now.
Yeah, but probably. So I spent the month whenever I was like going for a run or lifting weights, listening to the audiobook of Empire of AI, the new book by Karen Howe. Karen Howe has been a long-term tech reporter. She actually did I think the first full profile on OpenAI for MIT Review ages ago. And this book just came out. Actually, there were 2 books that came out on OpenAI, but hers was the one that Sam Altman and OpenAI didn't support. And I heard about it mostly from The Economist, who really praised it as one of the, I think, 10 books of the first half of 2025 that everyone should read. And I would definitely agree. If you want to catch up on the whole generative AI phenomena, this is the book to get, because it starts before that, gives you a general idea of what happened with AI before that, and then gives you a very extensive timeline re-narration of everything that happened with OpenAI from the very first moment. I think she's conducted over 300 interviews and looked at tons of materials, got a lot of leaked materials from OpenAI. So she goes very deep into the whole story. And that for me was like the first thing. So obviously we follow rather closely what's happening in this whole field of AI. But I love these kind of books where you kind of knew what happened, but then these books tell you the whole story and they fill all the gaps. Like, all right, this happened, and this was because of that, and then it filled this gap, and this then moved them to here, and this is why they changed tactics and things like that. So if you trying to catch up what's happening with that, this is a super helpful book. It's not very technical, so if you really want to understand the technology, this is not the book to get. I'm also not quite sure there is any book out there, because the technology part moves so fast that I'm definitely wouldn't want to write a book about the technological details, because it moves so fast. And so, I mean, it's already with this book where you I think her cutoff line is at the end of 2024, and you're already already so much has happened just in the last the first half of 2025 when it comes to generative AI and OpenAI. There's so many things already have happened, but now you have if you read or listen to the book, you have a much bigger understanding. The also really interesting thing is that she looks not only at all the companies, so she focuses on OpenAI, but she obviously talks about Anthropic and XAI and Elon Musk and Google and Meta, and tries to weave the whole ecosystem in. But then she also looks a lot of external factors or influences. That's why she calls it the empire of AI. So she looks at all the cheap labor around the world that is used to train the models and clean up the models. So one thing that I didn't really, so despite doing these talks at Republica 10 years ago about data janitors and all these invisible work around AI, I didn't really look too much into Scale AI, Alexander Wang's company, who basically took all of this talk about data janitors and turned it into their crazy business model for training generative AI and going from country to country in the global south, exploiting workers. And so she actually goes to a lot of these workers just to understand how it influences their day-to-day life, how dependent they are on these platforms, and how they don't give a damn about them, the platforms, just moving on, stuff like that. She also looks a lot into data centers and how they affect their surrounding communities, how annoying it is to live close to a data center, and looks a lot of the activists work there. So she provides a really complex and global picture of this, especially OpenAI and the influence that generative AI has on the whole world, basically, which I find rather helpful. The one thing that I had a problem with the book is that she has a very polemic, almost cynical tone that is very typical for what I would call performative criticism. Everything is taken at bad faith, and it's kind of it's annoying in a way that her arguments or the stuff she investigated is so strong in itself that you don't have to make it super explicit, but by doing it and this is all really bad, you always create a counter reaction in the reader, so that I felt wait a minute, is it really that bad and stuff like that. If she would just let the facts stand for themselves, I think the book could have been much stronger. But so just a couple of things that I found really interesting. So the official subtitle is Dreams and Nightmares in Sam Altman's OpenAI. I thought a good subtitle would also have been The Stories We Tell Ourselves, because that for me was fascinating, because I've always been fascinated by this whole industry being built on the foundations of doomers and boomers in AI circles, of a a quasi-religious approach to AI and AGI. And then how they would constantly shift their own internal narrative that basically would allow them to do anything. And if you've looked a bit into effective altruism and long-termism, there are very similar patterns. You just create this moral philosophy that allows you to be as shitty as you want, because in the end, it's about the good. And so for them, like when they understood, oh, we're coming from this non-profit idea of trying to prevent AGI taking over the world to, oh, we have to put as much compute into all of this, they found this metaphor of the race, like who's first is going to win. And that allows for everything. Whatever you do, how shitty it may be, if you don't do it, somebody else will do it and they're going to win the AI race and then you're fucked. It's always like you always want to like shout at them in their meetings and say, can you just for once ask, are we the baddies? Because they constantly say like, oh, we have to prevent this from bad actors exploiting it. And you're like, what if you're the bad actors? Just for 1 second think about this. And so this like one of the aspects, and then when that doesn't work, they learned, like especially in politics, they can always go, but China again. It allows for anything. Anytime Sam Altman tries to convince the people in Washington that they should do something, he always goes like, but China does this, and then they're always like, yeah, for sure. So this is like what it's really fascinating to see these like behaviors in there. And the one thing I would add is if you have a positive view of Sam Altman and you want to keep it, don't read the book, because he's just a
Why would you
manipulative
want to keep it?
asshole psychopath. And I'm not sure where this is taken. It's also, just so for example, like they not for example, but because the book really like starts with when he was ousted from the board, from OpenAI, by the board, and then it goes back and tells the whole story and then comes back to the situation. And like once you actually know the background of everything that happened, you much better understand why the board fired them. It was also really naive from the board to just fire him without any preparation, without any anticipation of the fallout. But you just understand it so much better. And this is what the book does really well. It gives you all the background and all the voices who were involved in all those stories and happenings. So yeah, I highly recommend reading it for anyone who wants to catch up and fill the blanks that you might have. It's truly helpful.
I do think, you made it a good example though, why it was probably hard for her not to write this book without making a very close judgment call, because as you just kind of like exemplified when you start talking about someone like Altman, it's just very hard to not get really upset and really emotional because, and I mean, I'm not using ChatGPT actually. I mean, I do use it sometimes, but it's not the tool of my choice. Not that I think necessarily the other guys are all kind of better. I mean, probably a bit just from a person to person
Elon
kind
Musk.
of. Well, I mean, that's that's not even a person anymore. But generally, I think there is a technology component to it. But there's also a cultural component to it, and I think that idea that those companies are brands, they do stand for something, even if they are not aware of that, they do stand for something, and their values are exemplified in their product. I think it's not always clear what shapes what, like in terms of where does that come from. But at the end, the question is always obviously who makes kind of decisions and why. And as you said, like, I mean, it kind of reminded me of Soviet tactics where you can always cry that it's the Americans. If we're not gonna do this, it will be the Americans who kind of do this. And I think that idea of invoking a bipolar world in a time where we're clearly not in one is something of a way of manifesting a reality that they need to keep operational and to sustain this idea that will allow other people to continue investing money into a company that, despite having very significant, revenue and act like a continuously growing business, I think for the most part is still losing a lot of money. And I think, are not problematic for them based on the brand. They're problematic for them as a way to dilute the idea that allows them to suspend disbelief in whatever they're proposing. Now, I don't think I'm a strong believer in box, but I think right now it's very hard to compete with the reality that those companies are creating. Just the sheer number of people using those tools more and more creates at a very staggering speed, I think, a new fabric of how we assume things should work. And I think that's problematic because a lot of those behaviors are shaped by a brand, by a company with very questionable values.
Yeah, and they're fully aware of that. I mean, that's for me the interesting part. Like I always in my keynotes, I always talk about Sam Altman as the example of somebody who tries to shape or invoke a certain future by the stories he tells. And it's clear from the book how he started in the beginning, do it intuitively, and then really pushed into the direction the more he understood like what he was fighting or like what could be dangerous to him. He got much more into that also because he's very good at that, and he understood better that this is like his skill. And so I find it really helpful. But for me, you're absolutely right with the problem of books right now. But for me, this is a perfect example of where it actually makes sense to take the time to get out of the daily flow of noise and take a step back and look at what's happened in the last couple of years and get the whole picture, connect all the dots, and then you understand. And then then everything that you read from then on, you have a different context for. You just okay, this is the dynamic between these two, and this is why he tweets this and stuff like that. So
making the effort.
So I mean, I also I follow my feeds and try to catch up, but then just like taking the time. I mean, that's for us also what we always want to do is like zoom out and also give you the listeners a bigger picture of where we see dots connecting, so we can better understand what's happening in the present.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there is still quite a strong discussion about how much AI is in this, how, what is really helpful about this. And I personally don't find this discussion very valuable because it perpetrates another reality that is much less scalable as a cultural kind of understanding of reality. So it spends a lot of time pretending that those tools aren't helpful, despite the fact that they are. They might not be as helpful as people are saying that they are, and they're not as helpful as they should be based on what they're trying to say. And they do make, people dependent. I think that connects to our episode with John as well. But I also think that a lot of people who are criticizing AI generally are doing that through the lens of not understanding how most of the work is being done today. And that kind of leaves it open to, just being easily ignored. And I think arguably, if you assume even remotely that AI is a paradigm shift or something of that kind of size, doing the effort, reading something like that should just have context. And I think that connects us, to authentically being able to articulate certain things. Those books are very helpful to get those things in order and understand the ideologies behind people who are building infrastructure.
There you go. That's it for today, I guess. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
Have fun reading or listening to our recommendations. There's going to be a test next time.
And listen to a little bit of Oasis.
Have a good one.
All right. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for making the time to listen to Follow the Rabbit. Please let us know your thoughts and suggestions by sending an email to ftr@knownunknowns.xyz. Like the episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And most of all, share the episode with others who might find it interesting. It really helps us out. Thank you so much for listening in. Talk to you soon.